The lecture and the questions and answers are being recorded by the EPA. Material will be made available on the EPA Ireland YouTube channel following from the event and may be used by the EPA for future communications. And the format for the evening, as we know, is the lecture will be about 40 minutes, followed by questions and answers. And I would ask questioners to identify themselves and to tell us if they're representing any organisation, so we can read the spin, if any. And to stand, the better for our cameras to see you. We're also accepting questions via Twitter using hashtag ClimateLecture2019. Our guest lecturer tonight has commented that climate change is far more than an environmental challenge. It is a profoundly human issue with far-reaching implications for jobs, homes, health, food and lives. And as a result, the United Nations Development Programme has described climate change as a human tragedy in the making. Michael has already introduced aspects of Dr. Cameron's expertise and experience, so without further ado, may I invite him to the podium.
So, thank you very much. I would like to start actually by thanking my colleagues and friends at the Environmental Protection Agency. I've commented over the last number of days that I've had the privilege of travelling all around the world to speak about climate change, but it's a special privilege to be able to come home, and it's a wonderful honour to be able to speak in a room that carries such national history. I also want to say that I can guarantee you I'm excellent value for a Tuesday afternoon, but I'm not so sure about being excellent value for a Friday evening in Dublin. So I want to sincerely thank all of you who I know have many, many other options for how you might go about spending your time, for giving your time so generously, for coming to participate in this conversation this evening. A word of housekeeping, and that is the very last slide of my presentation contains my contact details. And I sincerely make the offer that anybody who is interested in this subject, either because they would like to make a career in it or because they simply want to learn more about it, please feel free to contact me, and I would be very delighted to have further bilateral conversations with anyone that might want to do so. So we're going to get into the substance of the talk straight away. And I know most of you will be familiar with the story of climate change that essentially tells us about the coming apocalypse. But what I want to focus on this evening is a parallel story, not the one about threat exclusively, but the story about how what we know, what we've already started to do, and what we're capable of doing over the coming years is actually going to help us not only manage climate risk, but build a better world. A world where we manage unavoidable climate change, where we avoid unmanageable climate change, but also where we create an economic model where we have inclusive growth and shared prosperity. This is not simply a story about avoiding a threat. This is a story about how we use this moment in time to build a better world for all of us. As a consequence of that, this particular presentation is divided into 3 segments. The first segment is going to focus on understanding climate risk. And the reason for that is because if we do not properly diagnose the problem, then we run the risk of not only failing to manage it, but actually exacerbating the risk. In the second segment, we're going to talk about the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive world. And I'm going to pinpoint and highlight how government action right around the globe, coupled with leadership within the private sector, has provided us with the foundations of this better world. And the challenge we face over the coming years is to deepen and accelerate this transition. And then the final component of the talk, I'm going to give some recommendations as to what we can do as individuals to help deepen and accelerate this transition. What action we can take in our own lives, how we can enable other people to lead, and how we can be agents of influence to help stakeholders right across the economy, right across society, and right across the globe to lead to this better future. So let's start with climate risk. One of my favourite Irish isms is the story of the tourist who asks for directions in Ireland, and the response is, well, I wouldn't start from here. And the truth of the matter is, we should have started managing climate risk a long time ago. President Lyndon B. Johnson of the United States was presented with a climate change report in 1965. In 1987, the then President of the Maldives delivered a speech to the United Nations General Assembly, famously called the Death of a Nation speech, where he outlined the fact that his small island nation, that has been continuously inhabited for 3,000 years, would disappear off the face of the earth by the end of this century without urgent and ambitious action on climate change. In 1992, we signed the Rio Conventions, which included the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It took 23 years after the signature of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change before we agreed to the Paris Agreement. So we should have been busy on this issue a generation ago. But now we have begun, and we have to use this particular moment in time to accelerate action going forward. And that starts with understanding the dimensions of climate risk. Now, in 2014, a signature piece of research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, called the Fifth Assessment Report, was published. And this brings together more than 4,000 pages of peer-reviewed, published science from everything including climatology and oceanography to economics and social science. It is the definitive statement on what we understand about our climate system and the implications of pollution in our climate system for socio-ecological systems. And what I want to do is to boil down 4,000 pages of climate science into 4 words that you can leave this room with at the end of the evening. The first word is that climate change is unequivocal. It is not, to quote President Trump, a Chinese hoax. The climate is changing. It is changing as a consequence of greenhouse gas pollutants. We now have a concentration of greenhouse gas pollutants in the atmosphere unprecedented in the last 800,000 years. The consequence of that climate change and greenhouse gas pollution is that we are seeing a rise in global mean temperatures. And that is because more heat is trapped inside the Earth atmosphere because the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere prevent that heat from escaping back into space. The knock-on effects of this is that we see temperatures rising, we see an increase in intensity and frequency of extreme weather events such as hurricanes, we see changes in the distribution of water. Those places susceptible to flooding are more susceptible to flooding. Those places more susceptible to drought are experiencing increasing amounts of drought. We see an increase in vector and waterborne diseases. Where I live in the United States, for example, the incidence of Lyme's disease has tripled over the course of the last 15 years, with now more than 300,000 people reporting Lyme's disease and other diseases related to ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes on an annual basis. We see sea level rise. We see acidification of our oceans, which affects coral reef systems that are home to 25% of all marine life. All of this is unequivocal and captured in the science. Second, we know that this problem is urgent. We know that the issue is accelerating. The more we delay our action on climate change, the more we create a vicious circle of impacts. And the most recent science tells us that we have approximately a 12-year window to significantly bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions before we pass thresholds identified by science as being dangerous for social and ecological systems. Third, it is human. This has 2 components. First of all, climate change is not caused by solar flares or orbital variations or tectonic activity. It's caused by human activity. Principally, the fuel we use, the way we generate our energy, the transportation patterns we have, the way we go about land use practices, the agriculture that we have. It is principally caused by human activity. But second of all, it impacts human systems. For far too long, we have considered climate change to be an environmental problem, and the poster child for climate change has been the polar bear or the ice cap. But the reality is climate change undermines jobs. It implicates our ability to alleviate poverty. It affects where we can live. It has implications for human health. It leads to substantial fatalities, and it undermines human rights. 18 months ago, in 2017, 3,000 people lost their lives on the island of Puerto Rico as a consequence of a hurricane linked to climate change. Now, I always think that it is a mistake to compare and contrast one tragedy with another, but I can't help but notice that the number of fatalities in Puerto Rico mirrors identically the number of fatalities on 9/11. And yet compare and contrast for a moment the global response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11 with the lack of a global response to the loss of 3,000 lives in Puerto Rico. So lives, homes, health, human rights, all undermined by climate change. But finally, and perhaps most importantly of all for our purposes this evening, is that all of this is solvable. We have the technology, the innovations, the finance, the political systems and the policy mechanisms necessary not only to manage this risk, but to use this particular moment in time as an inflection point to build a better and more inclusive world. This particular map combines what we know about the science of climate change with what has happened over the course of the last 18 months. And I want to draw your attention, A, to the fact that impacts are global. This is not the problem of a distant people living in a far-off land. This is something that we face together as a global community. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that this is not tomorrow's problem. This is not something we will face in 2100. This is something that is active and real on a weekly basis as we speak. Now, in the western United States, we've experienced wildfires of a disproportionate magnitude. And one of the implications of the most recent wildfires is that it led to the bankruptcy of one of the largest power utilities in the United States, PG&E, which means that climate change for business is no longer an issue simply of operational or reputational risk. It's now an issue of compliance and legal risk. I also want to draw your attention to the eastern seaboard of the United States, because last year there was a group of hurricanes called Hurricane Michael and Hurricane Florence. And not only were these destructive hurricanes, but they were different hurricanes. Historically, a hurricane does damage as a consequence of how fast it spins and the wind damage that is left in its wake. These particular hurricanes were different because they were slow-moving, slow-spinning, and absorbed a lot of moisture from the water, which means the damage that they inflicted on North and South Carolina was flood damage rather than wind damage. The reason that's important is because most Americans living in those areas have wind insurance, but only 14% of Americans have flood insurance. And that illustrates that our financial and political systems were not keeping pace with the way weather systems are changing, and consequently, we are not properly diagnosing and dealing with risk. This is something that not only has implications in local areas, but it has significant implications right around the globe. Estimates suggest that the cost of climate change could be as high as $24 trillion, which is somewhere approximating 1/3 of the global economy. Now, when you think of how much investments in education and healthcare and human capital could be made with that money, how we could use that money to build a better and more inclusive society, then you begin to realize that arguments around climate change centered on the fact that it might be too costly to act, those arguments are myths, because the reality is it is far too costly for us to do nothing at all. Second argument is that climate change is not just about the environment, it's about human health. The burning of fossil fuels leads to 9 million premature deaths around the world on an annual basis. So this is not something that we can ignore from a human perspective. Now, one of the many important things we've learned to do over the course of the last number of years is we've taken a two-dimensional understanding of climate risk and we've turned it into a three-dimensional understanding of climate risk. And I want to explain what that means briefly and then use an illustration to really drive home the point. So the first thing to bear in mind about climate change is that it leads to an increase in the number of climate hazards we face. In other words, a hurricane. But if that hurricane stays out in the mid-Atlantic and never makes landfall, then we don't really have to worry about it. But then the second dimension of climate risk is introduced, and this is exposure. If the hurricane makes landfall in Florida, and if we've had such poor planning processes over the course of 20 years, where we're building infrastructure and homes and utilities and factories in places where they should not be built, then suddenly we have exposure to risk. And as a consequence of that, we face threats that we would not have otherwise faced. But importantly, there is a third dimension of climate risk, and that is vulnerability, which means what are our underlying weaknesses that exacerbate climate risk. The example I always use to illustrate this point is a tragic example related to women. As you can imagine, as I go around the world, I present a lot of data points, a lot of statistics on climate change. But the single most important data point that I've ever presented is the fact that 90% of all fatalities to a hurricane in Bangladesh in 1991 were women. Now, the obvious question is, how could that possibly be the case? Were the women exposed to a weather event that men were simply shielded from? The answer is that women could not leave home without a male guardian. Women had never been taught how to swim. Women had never been taught how to climb a tree. Women did not have access to information and therefore did not know the storm was approaching. Women did not have access to decision-making and consequently could not sit down with their municipal leaders and prepare public policy that would respond to their risk and enhance their resilience. Women did not have access to financial goods and services and consequently could not build savings, nor could they access a credit line, and consequently they could not draw upon financial resources to rebuild their lives after disaster struck. The reality is that women were subjected to structural discrimination, political, legal, cultural, social, and economic, that amplified the risk that they face. And if you look right around the world, you'll find that particular pattern repeating. Even Hurricane Katrina in the United States, where a substantial proportion of the people left behind in New Orleans were women, and particularly women of color. The point being, if you are from a low-income population, if you are a woman, if you are a person of color, if you are a member of an indigenous population, if you are disabled, if you are elderly, you are facing disproportionate impacts and asymmetrical impacts because of the way in which your society is constructed. Which means if we want to respond to the challenge of climate change, it's not enough that we put in place an environment policy or an energy policy. We have to tackle inequalities within our societies. We have to address structural discrimination. The good news is we have begun the transition away from climate risk towards resilience. And I want to give you a sense as to what that begins to look like. The first most important thing to talk about is the landmark Paris Agreement from December 2015. And again, like with my description earlier of climate risk, there's a limited number of words that I want you to walk out of the room at the end of this evening holding in your mind in order to understand the implications of the Paris Agreement. The first is that it is unprecedented in terms of participation. There are 196 countries around the world who have signed the agreement, and to date, only one country has signaled its intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and that is the United States under the leadership of Donald Trump. Every single other country on earth, irrespective of political ideology, remains committed to the Paris Agreement. That means it does not matter if you're a Christian Democrat in Germany, or a conservative in the UK, or a socialist in France, or a communist in China, or a theocrat in Iran, or a revolutionary in Venezuela. Irrespective of your ideology, you accept that climate change is real, you accept that the risk is important, and you accept the need to transition. Second of all, it is unprecedented in terms of its level of ambition. 189 of those countries have already got national climate action plans. And within those plans, they commit to reducing greenhouse gases, to mobilizing finance, and to building social and ecological resilience. This is more than an environmental agreement, however. This is an economic stimulus to the global economy. Because the second word to bear in mind is that the Paris Agreement is defining. If you look at those national climate action plans, there is more than $13 trillion of new investments in clean energy over the next decade alone. And if you combine the investments in energy with agriculture and land use and transport and industrial processes and urbanization, you find tens of trillions of dollars of investments. So the conversation changes from one about climate risk to a conversation about who is going to seize that money, who is going to use this economic stimulus to create the jobs of tomorrow, to build sustainable communities, to ensure that, for example, the next generation of Irish do not have to leave this island in order to seek employment overseas. Right now, China is the country seizing these opportunities, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Thirdly, it is immediate. The Paris Agreement is already being translated into national policies and state, provincial, and city policies right around the globe. Fourth, it is elastic. We have a foundation. Within that foundation, there is a mechanism that says governments will come back to the negotiating table every 5 years and they will, quote, progressively increase ambition over time. Which means Paris is not a last step, it is a first step. And using that first step, we can go on an ever more progressive journey into the future. But it is also elastic because countries like the United States can withdraw. And unless we continue to build a coalition amongst nations in support of the Paris Agreement, there is a chance that other countries will follow the US model and begin to withdraw. And then finally, it is incomplete. It provides us with a building block, it provides us with a foundation, but everybody who worked on the Paris Agreement knows that we need to go further, we need to go faster, and we do intend to use it as a platform to do just that. Now, I mentioned China, and the reason I hone in on China is because as I talk in the United States, one of the issues that's always presented to me is why should we act on this issue when China does nothing? And that is another major myth in the climate space. The reality is China is dependent on glacial water from the Himalayas for most of its fresh water. And most of China's economic output is centered around coastal regions that are exposed to extreme weather events and seawater intrusion and storm surges and sea swells. So China knows climate risk. China also knows that the biggest single threat to the Communist Party's hold on governance and power in China is social discord as a consequence of various types of problems, including environmental and air pollution problems. And additionally, China knows that with the right investments, it can become the clean energy superpower of the 21st century, just as the United States continues to invest in 19th century energy systems. So China has a 13th five-year plan, and within that five-year plan, they've committed to sourcing 20% of all of their energy from renewable sources by the end of the next decade. That is the equivalent of all the electricity generation in the United States today. And they've also committed a level of funding that is the equivalent of the Marshall Plan that reconstructed Europe after the Second World War. The benefits to all of this is that the largest renewable energy companies in the world are in China, and they are leading the world in terms of employment generation around a clean energy economy. Compare and contrast that to our good friend in the White House. Now, I could spend an awful lot of time talking about what President Trump is doing on a variety of issues, and not being an American, I'm capable of giving President Trump his due regard with the things I think he is doing well, and I can criticize him for the things I think he is doing badly. I am not part of a tribal, polarized polity in the United States. But when it comes to the issue of climate change, he is extremely destructive. And he's destructive for all manner of reasons. First and foremost, he is putting into positions of power people who are climate deniers. The Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, for example, is led by somebody who was a lobbyist for the coal industry. That pattern is repeated across key agencies of government. He's also repealed very important policies that had been put in place by the previous administration, notably policies that deal with energy and transport. But the single most important damage that President Trump could do on climate change relates to his power to nominate judges to the federal judiciary. All of the leadership the United States has shown on climate change over the course of the last 10 years results from one court case from 2007 called Massachusetts versus EPA. And with this court case, the federal government is obliged under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant. That in turn obliges the President of the United States to come forward with executive orders to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That was a 5-4 ruling in the Supreme Court of the United States. And if that ruling was overturned by a more conservative Supreme Court, not only would it stop climate change policies from the current president, but it would prevent any future president from taking a leadership stance on this particular issue. What this illustrates is that we as a climate or environment community must always make sure to understand how power works, to understand how to get hold of it, and to understand what the right theory of change is for our advocacy. If we spend all of our time protesting in the street and only advocating for the next environmental policy while ignoring what's happening in all of these other policy domains, then we run the risk of losing this particular battle. The most optimistic story that I've seen over the course of the last 22 years working on climate change, however, is the new level of leadership that we're seeing within the private sector. I mentioned earlier that the Paris Agreement sent a very critical signal to the real economy, and that signal has now been responded to. And as of today, there are 6,000 companies around the world who collectively are worth $36 trillion, or half the global economy, and they have made climate commitments. These companies come from 120 different countries. They range across 10 different industrial sectors. The commitments that they've made include, for example, purchasing 100% of their energy from renewable sources, having exclusively electric vehicle fleets, putting in place internally or advocating for a carbon price, ending all commodity-driven deforestation in their supply chain, and so on. These are very significant commitments. I want to draw your attention to the fact that a whole series of companies, more than 500, have now set science-based emissions reductions targets. This means that within their own companies and across their complex global supply chains, they have made a commitment to take on board their fair share of emissions reductions. Now, many of these brands will be well known to you, but if you look at Unilever, for example, they are present in more than 2 billion homes around the world on a daily basis. If you look at Walmart, they are responsible for 11% of all Chinese imports into the United States annually. They have 100,000 suppliers in the United States alone, which means when Walmart decides to go low carbon, the rest of the economy is forced to respond to that signal as well. So right across the economy, as a consequence of the leadership that is being shown by these companies, we're beginning to see a trend towards decarbonization. This slide is not intended as an endorsement of these companies. Companies are very complex ecosystems, and as with governments and as with individuals, some things they do well, some things they do very badly. What this slide is intended to demonstrate is that historically, people doing my job would have seen the private sector as antagonistic to our goals. Now the time has arrived where they're becoming our partners in implementation and ambition. Similarly, there's a whole range of companies who've committed to sourcing 100% of their energy from renewable sources. This again is important in terms of the stimulus that it gives to renewable energy generation, the warning that it gives to those who are heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, the signal that it gives that the high carbon economy is sunsetting and the era of the low carbon economy is beginning. But what I really want to draw your attention to on this slide is that these companies are now making location decisions, investment decisions, job creation decisions based on the availability of clean energy because they have communicated their commitments to the stock market. So, for example, Apple Computers recently decided to withdraw from Athenry because of permitting problems associated with their desire to generate on-site renewable energy, and they moved to Denmark instead. And right across the United States, companies are leaving states that will only provide them with fossil fuels delivered through a monopoly energy provider, and are instead relocating to states and provinces in Canada that are offering them renewable energy options. Now, one of the great success stories of Ireland over the course of the last 40 years has been the work of the IDA. And the argument that they've made overseas is, come to Ireland. We have a young, educated workforce. We have access to the single market. We speak English, as you do, and we have low corporate tax. The mantra of the IDA is Ireland at the heart of Europe. My guidance is that we need to change that mantra to Ireland at the heart of the new climate economy. We need to send representatives from the IDA to these 6,000 companies around the world, and we need to say to them, we will be your home for your transition to a new climate economy. You should bring your innovation, your finance, your job creation, your investment home to Ireland. One of the arguments often presented when we talk about the transition is that this is going to be damaging for jobs. And I want to emphasize that the opposite is actually the truth. If you look on the far right-hand side of this particular slide, you'll see that jobs in the coal industry have been declining substantially for 40 years. In the United States, right across the Rust Belt, there was a high of 250,000 people employed in coal in the late 1970s. Today, it's less than 50,000 people. That has nothing to do with climate change, and it has everything to do with automation and the fact that people simply don't want to buy coal anymore. Contrast that with the number of jobs being created in the new climate economy. Clean energy and other forward-thinking sectors are now creating jobs 12 times faster than the rest of the economy. So a commitment to climate action is not just a commitment to saving polar bears. It's a commitment to the jobs that the next generation will have. And these jobs are higher paying, and they don't come with black lung disease. And the last most optimistic story that I can think of over the last number of years relates to how we see innovation in the real economy. During the first 5 years of electric vehicles really beginning to emerge in the marketplace, it took those 5 years to sell the first 1 million vehicles. But the first 1 million vehicles of 2018 were sold in the first 6 months. And as a consequence, we are now beginning to see innovation, consumer demand, and the supply from the real economy keeping pace to what we need to do to facilitate this transition. I'm going to resist the temptation to bore you with the graphic, and instead now move on to the final segment, which is what can we do to lead this transition and to contribute to it. So over the course of the last number of years, what I've tried to do is develop a framework that very simply illustrates what each of us can do, what any company can do, what any government can do to help join and then lead this transformation. And this framework is based on 3 very simple principles. The first principle is act. What can we do within our own lives, with the decisions we make on a daily basis, to transition to low carbon, climate resilient, and inclusive practices? It's about our own agency. The second is what can we do to enable other people to act? Perhaps through the example we set, perhaps through the guidance and advice or education we offer. And thirdly, what can we do to influence systems change? Because if we begin and end with changing our light bulbs or simply taking public transportation, how do we get to scale? The reality is our own individual action counts, it provides credibility, but we really need systems change. And to lead systems change and contribute to systems change, we have to understand our potential to influence. So to make these a little bit more tangible, the first thing we have to do is understand our own greenhouse gas emissions and begin to reduce those emissions rapidly, but also cumulatively. This is not about taking one step. There is no one silver bullet. What there is a very large menu of options, and we can begin to draw from that menu to reduce our own greenhouse gases. There's an old adage in climate change that the problem is fuel, food,
and footnotes. Meaning if you were to address your fuel use and your food habits, that would make a substantial contribution to addressing this problem. So let's start with fuel. It really is about how much energy you use, what type of energy you use. So, for example, within your home, try to find ways to weatherize your home so that it's a more efficient home to live in. Try to find ways to save energy by turning off and unplugging your devices. Try to find ways to source energy from renewable sources. When it comes to your transportation and mobility patterns, fly less. Use more public transportation. I recently filled a car in Dublin with a full tank of petrol, and it cost me €80 to do it. And then I jumped on one of the best integrated transportation systems in the world, and I was able to get around the city cheaply. So again, this is not just about saving the environment. This is about eliminating the idea that what we need is a car, when what we actually need is mobility. We need to be able to get from A to B, and there are many ways to do that. We also need to think about our diet, what we eat and where it comes from, which brings us what I would normally call to the elephant in the room, but in fact it's the cow in the room. We all know that Ireland is heavily dependent on agriculture. Many of us in the room know that Ireland is on track to fail to meet its climate commitments as a consequence, in part, of the inability to address greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural sector. It's very important that we do this, not only domestically but globally. If you were to take cattle and turn cattle into a country, it would be the third largest emitting country on the face of the earth. And that is today, with a population of 7 billion people. We are on track to have a population of 10 billion people by 2050. And the food habits of those people are changing. We have a growing population, but we also have a growing global middle class. And that growing global middle class is moving from a vegetarian diet to a meat-based diet. So we simply cannot get to the point of building a low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive economy if we continue to ignore the damage that's done from land use practices, from agriculture in particular, from agriculture related to livestock. In addition to reducing our own emissions, the second thing we need to do in terms of action is we need to advocate for human rights. As I mentioned earlier with my example with women, this is not just about environment and energy. This is about how we address structural discrimination to make vulnerable populations more resilient. Which means if you have historically been an environmentalist, it's now time for you to learn about and advocate for human rights. If you are someone who has historically cared about the rainforest, it's now important for you to care about the homeless people on the street of Dublin. It's absolutely imperative that we link the world of environment with the world of social. But additionally, we find that when we link up these different parts of the social justice conversation, we give ourselves new communication devices to persuade those who have yet to act. So, for example, in my experience working with companies, some of them have said to me, we cannot take environment to our board. Our board does not care about environment. But they do care about women, and they do care about human rights. So if you turn this conversation into a conversation about women, then you can suddenly persuade people to act who never before would have acted on this issue. So this is not just a diagnostic issue. This is about how we go about persuading new constituencies to come in and support what we're trying to achieve. We need to invest in vocations. For this, I mean two things. First and foremost, include a sense of vocation in your own work and your own life. I always say to people when I travel the world that when I was growing up, I thought having a job was going to be the benchmark of success. And as I got a little bit older, I thought having a career would be the benchmark of success. A career is something where maybe you get a promotion, maybe you earn a bonus, maybe you get to wear a suit and stand on a stage. But what I realized is that the third progression is the most important one, and that is not a job, not a career, but a vocation. I work 16 hours a day on an issue that can often be tragic, but I get up every morning with a sense of mission, a sense of purpose, and the feeling that I'm contributing to a better world. And I know from my experience, talking particularly to millennials, that what they want for their professional life, given that they invest so much in it, is they want to have that sense of purpose. They want to feel they're creating, they want to feel that they're innovating, and they want to feel like they're making the world a better place. But what this also means is that you can have a vocation in whatever job you happen to have. If you're working in the financial services sector, you can become informed about this issue, and you can begin to advise your clients as to how they consider climate risk and invest in climate resilience. Irrespective of what job you are in now, you can incorporate and act on this issue in ways that you haven't done before. But beyond the action of individuals, investing in vocations is also really important as a government policy. Because who is going to weatherize our homes? Who is going to engage in sustainable agriculture? Who is going to put solar panels on our homes? Who is going to build wind turbines? Who is going to not only build electric vehicles, but build charging stations? We need to invest through our education system in the vocational training that will give us that infrastructure that we need, but that will also generate the profits, the economic development, and the jobs that our society and other societies need. We need to build a societal consensus, and we've already begun that journey successfully in Ireland with the Citizens' Assembly, the result of the Citizens' Assembly being the joint Oireachtas report. That is a model that is dearly needed in other parts of the world that are more tribalistic in their politics, because we have reached the limit of what we can achieve with the already converted. So what we've got to do is to reach out to people who don't yet agree with us, speak in their language, and persuade them to join us in this particular action. One of my favorite people in US broadcasting is a commentator who on every issue always says, "I'm not looking for heretics, I'm looking for converts." And we need to go out beyond the current environmental movement, and we need to earn converts. The Citizens' Assembly is a wonderful model for how we might do that. One of the ways we go about doing this is to employ different types of narratives and to understand that what excites us does not necessarily excite the audience we're trying to persuade. I learned this lesson when I was sent to Washington, D.C. to work for the government of the Maldives. And it was my job to go to Capitol Hill and try to persuade members of Congress to act on this issue. And I would find that if I went to speak about ecology and environment and polar bears, a certain number of people would speak to me, but the rest would close their doors shut. But if I went back the next day and I talked about the Bible, stewardship of the land, faith, God's creation, more people would speak to me. And if I went back the day after and talked about human rights and how the rights of women were undermined by climate change, more people would speak to me. And if I went back the day after that and talked about competitiveness and how we could build a better economy, more people would speak to me. And when Senator John McCain, who recently died, decided to become a leader on climate change, it wasn't because he cared about the environment. It was because the Admiral of the 6th Fleet of the US Navy went to speak to Senator McCain and told him that the biggest challenge they were facing was piracy off the Horn of Africa, and that piracy was caused by farmers who could no longer derive a livelihood from the land and were therefore taking to piracy on the high seas. If you look at the origins of the conflict in Syria, the origins were a drought in eastern Syria that forced farmers out of their land and onto the streets of Damascus. The point is, we have to find whatever message, whatever argument, whatever narrative works in order to persuade new people to join in our coalition of action. There are people who are uninformed. We have to inform them. There are people who are misinformed. We have to give them a solid evidence base and a new argument. But there are also people who are deliberately misleading. There are people who are vested in the existing economy, who make substantial amounts of money by ensuring that we continue on a high-carbon trajectory. There are people who are polluting our politics because they are unable or unwilling to separate fact from fiction. It is our job to call those people out. It is our job to isolate those people and ensure that they do not continue to pollute our politics and hold us back on this issue. And we can do that by continuing to emphasize that the science is on our side. There is no debate. 97% of all the peer-reviewed published science on this issue relates directly back to those 4 messages I gave you earlier. One of the most important allies we have in all of this that is not currently living up to its potential is the media. And there was a great book published by a gentleman called Nicholas Kristof a few years ago called Half the Sky, which is about women's empowerment. And in that book, Nick Kristof writes, "The media doesn't tell us what to think, but it tells us what to think about." The media has now got to get to a point where it is taking this issue seriously, giving it due attention, and providing us with the information we need to be equipped, empowered, and activated on this topic in ways that have not currently happened. There is a documentary coming out very soon about Fox News in the United States. And in that documentary, the man leading Fox News is quoted as saying, "We are not here to inform the public. We are here to make them believe that they're already informed." In other words, we are here to reinforce their existing biases. The media needs to return to a position of providing unbiased information, but one of the things it can and is beginning to do is we cannot continue to provide equal airtime to climate deniers. We need to have a cultural shift. We are often very good at putting in place new laws, but we're not often very good at changing culture. And yet, once again, we have examples to build upon. The Ireland of Bishop McQuaid is not the Ireland of a constitutional amendment on marriage equality. So we have demonstrated as a nation how we transition culturally to a more progressive stance on a whole range of issues. And once again, we can take that model to other parts of the world. Within the context of an individual company, I have a car that the engineers built to last for 25 years. And yet the partners in the marketing department of that same car company want me to replace my car every 3 years. So we don't need a new law. We need to change the cultural understanding of this issue, company by company, government by government, country by country, so that we realize consumerism and consumption is not the route to happiness, but living in a sustainable and inclusive world is far more important to us. We need to use the power of the purse. When we invest our savings in low carbon rather than high carbon, we send a message to the real economy. When we buy our goods and services locally, we send a message to the real economy. When we communicate to the people we are buying from that we're making these choices based on the fact that they're leading the transition, we send a message to the real economy. And think about how this can be done at scale. 19% of all GDP in the European Union and 19% of all GDP in China is public procurement. So instead of having a system where public tenders are awarded to contractors based on lowest cost, let's award those contracts based on lowest carbon. And let's see how the real economy will innovate in response to that market signal. We must improve our democracy. There are elections underway. Interrogate those people seeking office about their position on climate change. Make sure that they are prioritizing this issue. Make sure that they have tangible policies that they're going to implement on this issue. And if you find that they don't have tangible policies on this issue, stand for office yourself. There's a scientist in the United States who led on this issue in the 1980s, Jim Hansen, and he recently said, "We cannot fix the climate without first fixing our democracy." The power of the purse and the power of the vote. And then finally, we have to give an optimistic vision of what this new future looks like. If we continue to talk about the coming apocalypse, if we continue to frame this in the language of fear and threat, we run the risk of losing people's attention. If I were to say to you this evening, join me in a suicide mission for a doomed planet, you're probably more likely to leave this room and go to the pub. But if I said to you, get up out of your seat and work together to build a better world, you might feel activated. One of my particular heroes is a lady called Eleanor Roosevelt, who was both First Lady of the United States, but she was also the first U.S. delegate to the United Nations and was the chairperson of the committee that ended up writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when she died, it was said of her that she would rather light a candle than curse the darkness. We could spend far too much time over the coming years cursing the darkness. What we need to do instead is to get up off our seats and to give people a positive message as to what this new future looks like. My email is here. I welcome any comments, any questions,
any request for follow-up conversation. But for now, once again, sincere thanks for joining all of us tonight on a Friday evening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please, my family's in the room. You're going to embarrass me. Thank you. Thank you.
Edward, that thought crossed my mind just a few minutes ago, that such was your clarity and the manner in which you offered that rational and rich presentation, that it deserved a standing ovation, but that's not what happens at these events. But I'm very pleased that you got that.
Thank you.
So I congratulate you. I've done conferences and broadcasting for many years, and I've rarely heard a presentation just quite so good and so clear. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, we're open for questions, and I'd ask you to give us your name, organisation, if that's relevant, and microphones are in the room. I'll go left to right. Try to covet the microphone. It's not being used, and we get all the better. Somebody just here, yes. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Michael Byrne. I'm a farmer. I'd like to thank you for the presentation and also for throwing the responsibility back at us, of the people. However, I feel that the government and the politicians are the people we need to get this message through. And I wonder if you have any way of advising us how we should go about this. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer that directly? Well, the first thing I would like to say is that one of the things we have to focus on over the coming years is not just a transition, but a just transition. It's very important that we understand that we currently live in an economy where there are winners and losers, and we don't want to repeat that same practice as we go forward, which means it's very important that we have investment in, due regard for, and a lot of attention paid to people who are working in high greenhouse gas industries. So, for example, in the Appalachian region across the United States, where there's a lot of coal mining, in the Middle Eastern countries that are heavily dependent on oil and gas, and right around the world where there are people who are engaged in agriculture and are legitimately doing a wonderful job in enhancing food security for us as a planet. So I want to make sure that I emphasize the fact that as we transition to this low-carbon future, we've got to make sure that we bring everyone with us and that we pay due regard to the fact that people require livelihoods. When it comes to your questions about the government, my understanding is that Minister Bruton is about to bring out a series of policy recommendations that put some flesh on the bone, so to speak, of the recommendations that came out of the Citizens' Assembly and that have subsequently been adopted in the joint Oireachtas report. My hope is that this is not just a menu of policy prescriptions, but that there is a very active attempt to look at how we go about communicating this, not just in a broadcast sense, but how we go about continuing a dialogue with local populations so that we secure their buy-in, we secure their expertise, we listen to what they have to say in terms of concerns, and we build a joined-up government approach to how we go about this transition. I'm not a member of the government, so I can't speak to whether or not they will do that. But as I said earlier, I do think that the Citizens' Assembly does provide a very good model as to how we might go about this. It's certainly the case that governments right around the world are far better at making laws than they are at communicating this issue, not just from a broadcast sense, but again from the sense of actually securing buy-in to what they're trying to achieve.
But governments, 5 years is the usual term for a democratic government. It's very often less than that. That's not the ideal time frame for long-term decision-making and policy-making?
It's not, and actually there's two major problems that we face when it comes to timescales. One is in the public sector, one is in the private sector. So climate scientists have done a terrible job at communicating climate change. And part of the reason for that is jargon, And part of the reason for that is creating reports that are too complex and inaccessible and not very actionable. But part of the reason is they've created a vision of what 2100 will look like. Well, if you're the CEO of a company, your shelf life as CEO is typically around 6 years on average, and you're typically obliged to report profits on a quarterly basis. So a vision for what the world looks like in 2100 does very little good for you. And as a politician, here it's 5 years, but in the United States, if you're a member of Congress, it's every 2 years. So what we've really got to do is address the fact that it's not enough for us to protest at politicians. We actually have to give them a way of helping them to understand that their re-election is dependent on this issue. If we don't make it an issue of political liability or political value, then it's very hard to see how we can get them to act on it.
I noticed in the number of corporations that you had listed there with their logos, I've always believed that the vanity of the multinational is a very important lever. They're very vain companies, and they like to be loved. And it's when you get them exposed to, I think it happened to ITV last week with the decision just like that to stop that television program. I'm sure that was on the cards and being debated in all sorts of ways behind closed doors.
Just very quickly on this one point, the CEO of Walmart, when he was announcing the science-based target, he could have done that at a convention of food companies or grocers or in a sectoral or industry gathering, but he actually made that announcement at Net Impact, which is a gathering of millennials. And the reason for that is precisely because he wanted to enhance his reputation in front of a new demographic. So it's just a point that proves what you've just said, that this issue of reputation is one of many important motivating factors.
Yeah. Yes. Microphone. Yeah.
Thank you, Edward, and it's really important what you're saying. My question is really to the young generation, school children today, who are most vulnerable to the impacts coming down the track. Not so many young people here. I see some, but one would ask, this is an issue for this generation, and obviously they're the ones most at risk. What would you say to our society and to parents and to young people about what should they do now if they're so concerned about the impacts coming down on their future? What would you say to them as a way forward for them?
Well, I would refer back to the framework I gave, which is act, enable, and influence. I think on the influence side of things, there's been a wonderful wellspring of activism and advocacy from young people right around the world of late. We see, for example, Greta Thunberg of Sweden, who has become almost an overnight sensation, meeting with the Pope, speaking at the European Parliament, and so on, as a consequence of taking a principled stand on this issue. We see that reverberating through the school strikes right around the world, and there's an increasing tendency of many of these different movements amongst young people, whether it's the climate movement or the anti-gun movement in the United States, now coalescing around each other to demand holistic change within their country. So I actually do see an awful lot of activism amongst young people. What I would suggest, however, is that activism has to become more sophisticated. It's not enough to stand up in front of a decision maker and say, you haven't done enough. You actually have to get to the point of standing up and saying, here's what we think needs to happen. And as a consequence, I think the great value of young people and their activism is that they're opening a space for us to have this conversation, but that space now needs to be used. I would hate to see the young people leading on climate change right now become the 2019 version of Occupy Wall Street. One of the things that I do in my job is I compare different social movements. And it's interesting that Occupy Wall Street has been largely forgotten. It's interesting to note that the Arab Spring has been largely forgotten. It's interesting to note that the coloured revolutions of Eastern Europe have been largely forgotten. But the Tea Party in the United States has not been forgotten. And the reason why they have not been forgotten is because they turned protest into a plan for power. And it's very, very important that we now use this space that's being opened up by these young people to actually put in place policies that transition. The second thing that I would say is beyond influence and activism, they need to think about the changes that they will make in their own life, and principally changes around consumerism. I'm very concerned, for example, about fast fashion. which has become a major trend, and there are many UK and Irish brands involved in fast fashion. And that is a sector that is growing very, very quickly in terms of not only greenhouse gases, but also in terms of waste. So to encourage our young people to think less about consumerism and to think more about the type of experience they want to have in their life.
Fast fashion is changing your clothes too often.
Yes.
Yeah, and yeah.
Yep.
I was just working it out. It had to be that. But by the way, there was an amazing documentary which I wish Dorothy had shown, but really about Bangladesh and the clothing industry, Clothes to Die For. And it began with a 14-year-old girl talking to her pal about these were clothes to die for, and it was about a fire which killed 14-year-old girls making the clothes in Bangladesh. Are you aware of that program?
That's right, yeah. I'm actually aware of that incident. It was called the Rana Plaza collapse, and that was one of the things that forced companies to take this issue seriously.
You couldn't watch it without kind of changing gear, just as I think a lot of us probably have changed gear a bit tonight listening to you. Sabrina Decker has a question from outside the room, yeah.
One's inside the room. The first question is from Quinton Crowley. How do we create a cultural shift in land use, agriculture, and food production in Ireland? It's probably quite a big question.
Well, let's stay with one question. I'll come back for the other question, unless
Perfect.
it's related to that.
Not quite.
Okay, we'll take that one first, yeah.
So this is a very delicate answer because I don't want to give the impression that I'm beating up on one particular industry or on one particular country, but I will tell you what I've decided to do. I've decided to make a change in my own life and adopt a vegetarian diet. And I've done that because I simply don't find it sustainable anymore to go around the world advocating for action while my own lifestyle is out of sync with what I'm asking other people to do. So one of the ways in which I think we create a cultural shift is for people to change their own diet and to begin to communicate to others around them as to why they're doing that. Another thing that I'm doing is, I'll be completely honest, and my family in the room can back me up on this. I grew up in Dunleary, and the number and the letter 46A used to frighten the life out of me. I hated queuing in the rain. I hated waiting in traffic. I hated everything to do with public transportation in Dublin. And every time I come back to Dublin, I only use public transportation because I've discovered, compared to other parts of the world, we have a wonderful transportation network. And so, having that conversation about how much do you actually use your car? It spends most of its time being parked, and what you're looking for is not a car, you're simply looking to get from home to office, or from office to shopping centre, or whatever it is. But make that own decision in your own life to switch your transport, your energy, and your food practices, and then talk about it and explain why you're doing it to other people, and suddenly we'll create a movement.
Sabrina, the other question?
So the second question is, given the climate risks and impacts Edward has outlined, does he agree adaptation is still the Cinderella of climate policy, with the effort, investment, and discussion focusing on mitigation? What can be done to raise awareness of the need to adapt?
That's a great question, and absolutely yes, I do believe it's the Cinderella of climate change. So most of our activity is focused on what I call avoiding unmanageable climate change. So before the Paris Agreement, we were on course for 4 degrees Celsius of temperature rises by the end of this century. And to put that into context, the basic crops we depend upon globally for food security, wheat, maize, corn, and rice, will not grow at 4 degrees Celsius of temperature rises. So very legitimately, we focused our attention on reducing greenhouse gases. But in addition to avoiding unmanageable climate change, we've got to manage unavoidable climate change, the things that are happening already before our very eyes. And that means a greater focus on resilience, but it also means a greater understanding of risk and recognizing that if we are to build resilience, it's not about building a flood defense, it's not about putting reinforced concrete in a building, it's actually about tackling structural discrimination and intersecting inequalities so that some of these more vulnerable populations are provided with a pathway to resilience. So it's a critical question and something we absolutely have to focus on.
You said in the course of your presentation that Ireland had kind of led the world on some issues. One of them I think might be tobacco use in. People thought that was smoking in pubs. It was actually smoking in the workplace was the lever in that particular case. But do you think there's a possibility that we could, if the IDA were to go your route, that we could make a big impact?
I do. I think there's a lot of things that are not necessarily climate related that we can build upon. So, for example, I speak to a lot of audiences of varying political persuasions, and interestingly enough, the audiences that tend to critique me the most are the more left-leaning audiences. And they do this because they don't like the fact that I'm working with companies. And yet my attitude is, if you're going to solve a problem, you have to work with the people who've caused the problem. Well, a wonderful example of doing that is the Good Friday Agreement. If we had decided we're not going to talk to the people participating in conflict, we would not have ended the conflict. So there's a way of fostering dialogue, a way of understanding that you have to treat the causes of the problem in order to build the solution and make that a sustainable solution that we have experience with. There's another, I would say, maybe more historical analogy, and that is we know what it's like to recreate our country and our economy systematically over generations. And so being able to lead the world in this conversation about the just transition is something I think we're well equipped to do.
Yes, here. Microphone coming. Yeah.
Michael Brain, science teacher. Very grateful for the fact that the YouTube video of this lecture is going to be a powerful education tool in the classroom, science classroom, geography classroom, any classroom. Our wonderful transport system, I would love to ask anybody who can tell me, how can we prevent the decision makers from, for example, the ludicrous situation of ordering 200 diesel-only buses before transforming ultimately to electric buses, and also the pretense that that hybrid buses are the answer because they're only a small step. London has an increasing number of electric buses. China has thousands, I believe. How do we persuade them to change?
I personally don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect there are members of various government agencies in the room who'd be able to have a conversation with you about that. What I would say is, when I talk about the wonderful transportation system, I am, of course, comparing it to other transportation systems. I'm not saying it in absolute terms. I do think, however, again, this is an illustration of where we need joined-up government, because one of the things that strikes me coming back to Dublin after being away for so many years is how the city used to have its southern barrier essentially at Bray and Shankill, and the southern barrier of Dublin is now stretching all the way down to Kilmore Quay, essentially, with people commuting in and out of Dublin on a daily basis over massive distances and using massive amounts of carbon to do that. So we have urban sprawl as a problem, we have congestion as a problem, and yet why don't we build higher? So that to avoid that sprawl, we can concentrate more housing in a localized area, which will help us with sanitation, with energy infrastructure, with water infrastructure, will help us with the housing crisis and so on. Why did it take so long to have an integrated transportation system where you could use the same ticket off a Dublin bus and onto the Dart? There are many, many things that I think we can address. It struck me this week, just being home, that the Premier Milk dairy carton has a picture on the back of it of an electric vehicle. And that electric vehicle now sits at a museum. We used to have electric vehicles delivering milk in Ireland, and we got rid of them in order to bring in the internal combustion engine. And now we're telling ourselves we need to bring these things back. So sometimes the innovations we need are not necessarily new. Sometimes they're a return to common sense.
I can remember the St. Patrick's Day parade when 50 Johnston, Mooney and O'Brien electric vans formed one of the wonders of the world. 50 of them in a convoy. But they were electric. And you could also, by the way, this is really dating me, you could hold, if you were a very clever cyclist, not a very dangerous thing to say, but you could hold on to the back hinge and go to school if you had a very good sense of balance. Anyway, yeah.
Hi there, thanks a lot for your talk. Callum Swift, doctor in HSE. I was just wondering, you seem very optimistic that we'll be able to transition to a clean, carbon neutral and sustainable economy in the existing economic model that we're using, with all the examples you're giving of the companies making progress. But that economic model is kind of predicated on continual economic growth, and that, as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence that we have managed to decouple that growth from resource use and carbon emissions. So I was just wondering, are you convinced, or are you optimistic that we can do that in the existing model, or do you think we'll need to move to something that has different measures, for example, not GDP growth, but more human-centric measures of happiness or progress or Yeah, thank you.
That's, again, a very interesting question. I'm often asked, in fact, I'm often told that capitalism is the problem. And my response is always, well, what type of capitalism are you talking about? Are you talking about Swedish capitalism, where a man gets 16 months of parental leave? Are you talking about Rhineland capitalism, where trade unions sit on the board of a company? Are you talking about Chinese capitalism, or are you talking about Republican US capitalism? So I don't know that the problem is necessarily, quote-unquote, the system, because there are many systems. I do believe that we need to fundamentally change some of the things that you're talking about. So one of the great innovations that the CEO of Unilever made was to abolish quarterly reporting, because that gave him license to think about long-term investments and think about sustainability. If he hadn't done that, he would have been pressured quarter by quarter by quarter, not just to deliver profits, but ever-increasing profits that would have completely derailed what became the vanguard of sustainability within the corporate sector. I absolutely do think we need to get rid of not only GDP as a measurement, but the fact that whenever you turn on the nightly news, you're not presented with air pollution numbers on the ticker tape at the bottom of the screen. You're presented with numbers about whether the stock market has risen or fallen. And for the most part, that is not a proper reflection of the wealth or well-being of individuals living in our society. We need to change the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that engineers increasingly build things to last, but people working in marketing departments are encouraging us to buy and sell and buy and sell. So there's many, many things about the system I think we need to change, not just the economic system, but the political system as well. We talked about, for example, the lack of long-term planning as a consequence of rapid electoral cycles. A major problem in the United States is not a climate problem. It's, again, another decision of the US Supreme Court, which is called Citizens United. And this essentially gives companies free rein to spend as much money as they want during election time, which makes politicians more responsive to their donors than they are responsive to their electorate. So I absolutely believe that we need systems change. My only point is, as we're working towards systems change, let's get on with doing the best we can with what we have. I don't think it's an either-or. I think we need to get started. I think we need to get moving. I think there's a lot of elasticity in the system we have that we can use to our advantage, but that is not a substitute for real systems change.
And is that suggestion that you make that on nightly television news there ought to be more relevant statistics of what happened today in terms of, say, pollution as opposed to stock exchange, which can be got on the internet anyway? What you're looking for in TV news is kind of something that's going to get over to more people. Has that case been made to the broadcasters?
Not to my understanding, no. I think that...
Well, why don't you make it? Because
happy to.
You need to put these things on the agenda. They don't happen at the first letter, but embarrassment, or what are we going to do about that? What are we going to say to this guy? I mean, as it happens, you may or may not know this, but, and indeed I think he's a Dunleary man as well. He may be in the room or not, but I've said it behind his back, so I'll say it here. I think we're very fortunate that in George Lee in RTE News we have somebody who knows the big picture and who can tell the story in 2 minutes. I think George is an outstanding broadcaster in terms of just getting the big picture ideas of climate change over. And I'm sure you all agree with that. But
the one other thing I would say is George Lee would be great, but Kim Kardashian would be better. And I say this deliberately. I don't know if many of you are aware, but the youngest Kardashian, and I'm 43, so I don't know if it's Kylie or Kendall, but the youngest Kardashian became the youngest ever female billionaire recently. But interestingly, last year she made one tweet about Snapchat. And based on that one tweet about Snapchat, it eliminated $1.2 billion from their share price because she simply wasn't happy with Snapchat. Now, she's part of a new generation of people called influencers. And if you get those people to talk about climate change or any other subject under the sun, then you begin to see changes in the real world, because the reality is a lot of people aren't getting their news anymore from the RTE 6-1 news or the evening news. They're getting their news from influencers on the internet.
There's one point I've made at this meeting before, and I want to put it to you. I think that this agenda, that among the many people who need to know it, know the grammar of it, are weather forecasters. We're lucky enough in Ireland that we have scientists who are our weather forecasters, but they too give us a lot of jargon. But I think they're hugely important, and not that they would make a point every night, but on the big nights or on a night when something odd happens, that they know what they're talking about and they can communicate to everybody very quickly.
Absolutely.
And they're with us every news bulletin. Yes, here.
Hi, I'm Sinead O'Keefe. Just going back to the whole point on Gen Z and influencers, because I'm a millennial, I work within fashion, technology, innovation and startups. A big problem I'm seeing right now is that people are trying to make an impact, but they're going to substitutes instead of solutions. So even though they're not maybe taking a plastic bag, they're taking something that's from a startup company, but that still isn't actually biodegradable for a number of years. Or with fast fashion, they're going to, the likes of H&M are launching collections that are sustainable, but it's greenwashing. So how do we, even for myself, I'm trying to just go back to basics, so not even looking at what substitutes are being brought out, but how do we make that as a mass message and kind of stop this whole substitutes instead of actually tackling the solution? How do we influence that?
So I think that's a very good point. And somebody asked me a similar question last week in New York. They said, well, you're talking about replacing internal combustion engine vehicles with electric cars, but what if we have so many more electric cars that it negates any benefit that we earn from that? So you're absolutely right, we need solutions rather than merely substitutions. I do think that a lot of it comes down to the issue of messaging, persuasion, and helping people understand that the consumerism we've built over the course of the last 5, 6, 7 decades, whatever it happens to be, that consumerism is in and of itself destructive. And more to the point, it really isn't a pathway to happiness. I think if I turn on the television in the United States, and it's after 8 o'clock, so I can be a bit salty about this. If I turn on the television in the United States and I'm watching golf, the advertisements are about Mercedes C-Class and erectile dysfunction pills. If I turn on the American football, the advertisements are about Budweiser beer and pickup trucks, because the advertisers know who's watching and they know how to reach them. But more importantly, when they're talking about a pickup truck, they're not selling me a car, they're selling me freedom. They're selling me the open road. They're selling me vistas of America. And what we do in the climate community is we're selling sacrifice. We're selling threat. We're selling fear. We're telling people it's time to go back and live in the cave. And so I think actually people like me are becoming less important, and people who are involved in social media and advertising and publicity and who understand communications are becoming so much more important. I remember growing up in Ireland and seeing advertisements designed to end smoking. And most of the advertisements was somebody dying of lung cancer in a hospital. They didn't have much of an effect. And then I moved to Belgium and I went to the cinema, and there was an advertisement in a Belgian cinema, and it was a young, attractive girl going about her day. She was at school, she was going to sports, she was meeting her friends, she was going out in the evening. And at the very end of the advertisement it said, she's young, she's free, she's independent, she doesn't smoke. It was selling giving up smoking as a cool lifestyle choice, as opposed to, if you continue down this path, you'll die in a hospital ward. So I really do think that we have all the information we could ever need on this issue. Now we need to get clever and sophisticated about how we sell this as a positive lifestyle change as opposed to a sacrifice.
Woman here, yes.
Hello, that was a beautiful presentation. I've done my Master's in Environmental Sciences 2017 Trinity, and for the last 2 years I've been working with one of the leading energy providers here in Ireland, and I was in the sales department. What that required of me was to talk to about 100 people every day for 5 days a week, and the conversation is always the same. How much was your electric and gas bill? And the answers I got, like, through the course of the conversation would be, I hate huge gas bills coming in, so I'd like my open fire. I just go down to the shop, buy my briquettes, and I'm happy. So my question is, how would you convert someone sitting in their home, someone from Dunleary, someone from Swords, someone from maybe Clondalkin? How do you make it common household talk that climate, this whole issue is so much more important, and you should stop looking at things, ways of the past? How would you do that?
So I think your question is about the economics of this issue, is that right?
it's not just about the economics, it's also about the mindset of people, how they're focused on, like, it's got to do a lot with economics as well, but also the mindset of people. So if they find like this is higher, then the only other alternative is this, instead of something brand new, which could be like much more better, something like that.
So again, I would say that one of the things we need to do is to get better about communicating this issue. So most people have this understanding that fossil fuels is cheaper than renewable energy. What they don't realize is that close to $500 billion per year annually is spent on perverse subsidies to keep fossil fuels artificially low, and we don't pay nearly as much in incentives to renewable energy to make them cost competitive. That being said, they are increasingly cost competitive. And if you were to have a situation whereby, through government policy, we were investing more money in helping people to access the low-carbon options, ultimately you find that money returning to your pocketbook. So, for example, an electric vehicle might be a bit more expensive right now to purchase than the internal combustion engine, but once you have that electric vehicle, the amount of money you're spending on a weekly or monthly basis on fuel drastically declines and in some cases disappears. Similarly, if you're spending money initially to weatherize your home, the amount of money you save on heating bills and electricity bills, that money more than pays for itself after a short time period. So I think there are things that we can do through policy to front-load the action that makes the economics more acceptable and palatable. But then again, it becomes an issue of messaging. So where I live in Vermont, one of the reasons why I'm persuaded to think about solar panels on my home is because there's so many people in the neighbourhood who've told me the capital costs up front are eliminated very, very quickly, and then all of a sudden you won't be getting that $400 bill from X and you won't be getting that $200 bill from Y, and that becomes extremely appealing. So I don't think it's a one or the other. I think it's a combination of making the economics right and, again, of communicating the issue more effectively than we have.
And with the right kind of loan system,
yes,
well sold, the repayments on the loan could be lower than the cost of the bill.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, time for one more question, yes. Somebody here? Yep.
Yes, I would like to come back to that economics question because we have a Minister for Finance who very often reviews books on economics in Saturday's Irish Times, and he invariably finishes by criticising the fact that the book he is reviewing does not acknowledge our dependence on growth. And, I mean, he obviously thinks there's no alternative to our dependence upon growth. And I just wondered if we could call upon the economic departments or, the relevant departments in our universities and elsewhere to educate people like our Minister for Finance, to demonstrate how we can be capitalists and yet not be dependent upon this idea of constant, ever-increasing growth?
No answer to give you other than I agree completely with what you just said.
Well, that's an appropriate comment perhaps at the end. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And can you just repeat it's a very common sense and easily remembered email?
Yes, my email for anyone who wants to reach out is edward, EDWARD, @CameronClimate.com, and I sincerely welcome any message anyone would want to send.
Yeah. Think of CameronClimate.com. Edward, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.